Hello, I'm Dr. Magryta. I am here to discuss today GLP-1 agonists for children. And in specific, I want to really look at the data as to where are we getting the recommendations from? Why has the FDA approved this drug for children with excess weight gain? The American Academy of Pediatrics has also put their weight behind it. But what do we know really about this drug? And is it the best option for children or is it not, right? We need to look at the data to decide what we really have going on here. But most importantly, the first thing we need to understand is what is a GLP-1, right? So GLP-1 stands for glucagon-like peptide 1, and it's a hormone, an incretin actually by definition, which is a protein that is involved in blood glucose homeostasis or regulation, i.e. trying to keep blood glucose a normal level. We know that the body despises elevated levels of sugar or low levels of sugar in the bloodstream, and is very tightly regulated to prevent high blood sugar, which in response to high blood sugar, the body will release insulin. Insulin will then take the blood sugar and ask the cells, especially in the muscle, to take that sugar up and form glycogen, but it also asks fat cells to take that sugar up and store it as energy. On the flip side, if blood sugar gets super low in the bloodstream, then an opposite hormone will start to ask the system to do its job, and that's glucagon. And that says, hey, we need to release more blood sugar. So it's the counter-regulatory hormone to insulin. And GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide 1, is a hormone incretin that's involved in this process specifically. And what it wants to do is lower these blood glucose levels, specifically by increasing insulin secretion from the pancreas. And again, that's an endocrine activity as opposed to the pancreas where it has exocrine activity, which is releasing enzymes that are involved in degradation of food products as they come through our GI tract. In this case, it's the endocrine responsibility, and that is the production of insulin by the beta cells of the pancreas. So GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide 1, specifically wants to increase the sensitivity of the release of insulin from the pancreas to help keep blood sugar levels normal inside the cell. The GLP-1 in itself is made by intestinal endocrine entero-L cells or enteroendocrine L cells. They're located mainly in the distal ileum and in the colon. And we also find that certain neurons in the brain, stem, are also involved in response to fats and carbohydrates consumed during meal via the oral route. We will see GLP-1 be secreted as well. Interestingly enough, GLP-1 is not secreted when somebody gets IV glucose. That's interesting. So if we see that happen, then we go, okay, the probability there is then this is truly a stimulated event only through oral intake. And that's super critical to the understanding of how this hormone is released and how we as humans get excess weight gain over time. And it's clearly not an IV route, which would make sense because evolutionarily, IVs were not something that we ever had to deal with. So the route of understanding of food and its metabolic effects on the human frame would be an oral route primarily, and that's the sufficiency understanding. We now know that the secretion of GLP-1 is biphasic. There are two phases of an early phase being vaguely induced and also a late phase being the direct L cell activation in the intestine. So oral consumption of food, vaguely induced signal that says, okay, we need to start releasing GLP-1 because we're eating food. And then the flip side is as the food gets down to the distal ileum and colon, there's a secondary response at the direct L cell level that says, okay, we need to release some GLP-1. GLP-1 in and of itself is degraded relatively quickly by dipeptidyl peptidase 4 within minutes inside the body. Let's look a little bit closer again at the functions of the hormones, right? So again, insulin and glucagon, they work in opposite directions. Insulin released from the beta cells, glucagon released from the alpha cells, and this is the endocrine portion, again, of the pancreatic function. Insulin tells our cells to take up glucose by a glucose transporter in the cell surface, and it also tells the liver to stop making glucose, which is super important. So we can think of insulin as this stored energy hormone. It's wanting us to keep energy stored in muscle primarily as glycogen, and then secondarily, again, in fat as an energy source, and as well in the periphery and in the liver, right? So this is super important as well, that we, through insulin, will store our sugar as fat in the liver and as fat in the periphery. Glucagon, again, in the opposite direction, works by telling the liver to make glucose because we don't need to store it. We're low and we want more of it. Again, this would be something in the hypoglycemic state. And then it also tells muscles to release glycogen and break it down and turn it into glucose. Thus, again, releasing blood sugar into the bloodstream, helping a potential hypoglycemic state. And the whole process then of this counter-regulatory effect is to help the body understand when and if it wants to have access to sugar in the bloodstream, but primarily what it's trying to do is tightly regulate the blood sugar so that we don't end up with positions where we have too much blood sugar or too low blood sugar. And this is critical, sort of like pH in the bloodstream. The body wants to keep a tightly regulated pH because that's how cells function at their best. If we're too low in pH too acidic or too high in pH too basic, we don't work as well. All right, so this is sort of critical. So I want to just, belabor this point a little bit as to why these hormones are so important. So let's look at this slide. From the journal Diabetes Therapy in 2019, we have this beautiful slide that lays out what's actually happening with GLP-1 and the functions of GLP-1 in specific. And if we look around the slide, we see that it's actually a hormone that affects multiple aspects of the body, multiple places within the system that are fully directed by GLP-1 activation, right? So let's look at it. We start in the brain. In the top center of this diagram, we see that within the brain, GLP-1 decreases food intake, decreases water intake, increases neuroprotection immunologically. We'll get to that in a second. Increases neurogenesis, or in that case, I might like the production of new neurons. Those all sound really important. And oh, by the way, they all sound like they are against the aging of the brain. Fascinating. Heart and vessels. So let's look at the cardiovascular effect. Increased glucose utilization, increased cardioprotection, increased cardiac output, increased vasodilation, decreased fatty acid metabolism. Those are all good, right? And there is now data that show that the medications that are GLP-1 agonists in adults are cardioprotective and are reducing the risk of a cardiac death. That sounds really good, okay? We don't know this in children. This is a children's discussion, but that's a really interesting thing. So if it's cardioprotective adults, is it cardioprotective in children? And could this then help us over time reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease as children age into adults? Kidneys, increased diuresis, increased natriuresis. Immune system, critically decreases inflammation across the board. And we're going to get a little bit deeper into this in the next slide. I think that's the most important part of this drug's function, or this hormone's function endogenously in the body. In skeletal muscle, we see increased perfusion, increased glucose uptake, both good. In brown adipose tissue, increased thermogenesis, very good. The more brown adipose tissue you have, the healthier you are. That's more mitochondrial function, more mitochondrial energy, more heat release, which in general is associated with good health. White adipose tissue, increased perfusion, increased lipolysis or breakdown of the fat cells, increased glucose uptake where needed, right? So that sounds good. Liver, decreased steatosis, fantastic. Decreased ApoB cells, or the VLDL, LDL cells, fantastic. And decreased glucose production endogenously, fantastic. So far, we're seeing only really good things coming out of this. In the gut, increased growth, decreased motility, and decreased lipoprotein secretion. All sound reasonable. Pancreas, increased insulin secretion or biosynthesis, increased somatostatin secretion, increased beta cell proliferation, decreased glucagon secretion, and decreased beta cell apoptosis. Those are all very useful. And I like the last one there being super important. If you are stopping the beta cell apoptosis, you by definition then are increasing the release of the volume of insulin to the system. So if you are increasing synthesis, myosynthesis of these beta cells, decreasing the death of the beta cells, that's a double positive towards helping release more insulin, which then helps control the blood sugar inside the bloodstream. And then increased beta cell proliferation also is going along with that biosynthetic piece. So that's all very good. And then the last piece, stomach, decreased gastric emptying, decreased acid secretion. Now, the decreased acid secretion in younger people may be very useful if they're suffering from GERD or other things. If you're older and you already have low acid, that could be a secondary problem, so that's something to pay attention to. Decreased gastric emptying, that'll make you feel more full, right? So that's a good thing. If you are feeling full, then you're less likely to eat more. But is there a possible side effect to that? And we'll get into that a little bit. So let's look at the most important aspects of this whole chart, because we went through a lot there. Most important aspects: increased insulin secretion, decreased glucagon secretion, increased satiety, increased lipolysis, decreased steatosis or liver fat. Those right there are massive. And then a sixth and real important one is inflammation reduction. Now let's go there and looking at inflammation reduction specifically from the lens of the immune system. Let's look at the immunology of GLP-1. And let's first look at the slide here. We'll look at the picture on the left, which was published in the journal Schizophrenia Bulletin Open by Tomasik, Tomasik, in 2020. And they entitled this article, Leptin Serum Levels Are Associated with GLP-1 Receptor Agonist-Mediated Effects on Glucose Metabolism in Clonazepam or olanzapine-treated prediabetics. And what I found interesting in this slide is you look at what happens when the GLP-1 receptor gets activated. And you can see in this case, you see a immediate change in the function of NF-kappa B, which is one of the prototypical immune inflammatory mediators throughout the body. You see a change in FOXO1 activity, which is critically important. And then look at caspase activation, inflammasomes, right? Inflammasomes are super important now in understanding inflammation. We know that inflammasomes are activated, especially LRP3 and LRP1 are activated by uric acid, which is a breakdown product of protein degradation. But more importantly, in modern society, it's a breakdown product of fructose metabolism, going all the way via the degradation pathway to uric acid, which then is a trigger for inflammasome activation. So this GLP-1 receptor activates to turn on the AKT PKB pathway, which then will decrease this inflammatory cycle, which is incredibly important. And I think that's one of the main layers and reasons behind the effectiveness of these drugs, and is in this case specifically of this incretin. And so that's the biggest piece here that I wanted to look at. And then when we look at the second diagram on this page, we see that an article published in Molecular Innate Immunity in 2022 by Chen et al. Called GLP-1 receptor agonist as a modulator of innate immunity. And so what does this all mean? And in this case, I found this picture to be even more enlightening. Well, you see the GLP-1 hormone or incretin comes and touches the receptor and then turns on three pathways here. We've got the PKA STAT3 pathway, which we critically important involved in Th2 polarization. We've got the PI3K AKT pathway, which we somewhat just talked about. And then we've got the MAPK NF-kappa B pathway. And then when you look at what comes out of this, we have a block INKT or natural killer cells, innate natural killer cells. We have a production of regulatory cells, which is very important. We have a change in macrophage activation from M1 or aggressive type to M2. And that whole situation plays out to reduce the total inflammation inside the body. And so GLP-1 in and of itself is hitting on pathways anthropologically that we've had for millennia that are helping us reduce inflammation. So you think about this in the fasted state, you get a turn on of GLP activation, right? So in the fasted state, we know people benefit on many levels when they go through intermittent fasts, right? And it looks like GLP-1 is mediating some of that by saying, hey, we need to start working on insulin sensitivity so the sugar we do have, we are capable of utilizing it appropriately. And oh, by the way, we need inflammation to be in check during this period of time. And when we look at this diagram, you can see what do they write about in this piece, right? Where they say the brain protected from ischemic injury when GLP-1 is activated. That's wonderful. Ameliorate neuroinflammation. Wonderful. Reduce appetite. We know that already because that's one of the main functions of this drug. Alleviate behavioral deficits. That I found interesting, and I've not seen much supportive evidence to that, but that may be a function of how the foods then and of themselves, with like Dr. Chris Palmer's work at Harvard, that the foods in and of themselves, especially the ultra-processed foods, do affect mood. We know that tremendously. Maybe this is a piece of that. When kids are eating constantly these ultra-processed foods, that's suppressing GLP-1 activity, which then is causing behavioral problems. And maybe the lack of GLP-1 is part of that, or it's just an associated finding. I don't know that answer. Cardiovascular, here we go again. Reduce intravascular oxidative stress. That's fabulous. Increase myocardial cell activity. Fabulous. Enhance vasodilation. Fabulous. Improve cardiac function. All of these things are excellent, right? So we like that. We look at the pancreas. What happens? Promotes insulin secretion. We've already talked about that. Stimulates beta cell proliferation. All this stuff is promoting this benefit of insulin sensitivity over time. And then in the liver, inhibits hepatocyte gluconeogenesis, which we love. We don't need more sugar in these cases. And then suppresses oxidative stress. And again, that oxidative stress is a big piece of this discussion because oxidative stress stimulates inflammation. So the more we can avoid this inflammatory response, the more likely we are to do better. And again, I'm bringing in the uric acid piece because I think that activation of the NLRP3 inflammasome by food, specifically the sugared beverages, is driving a lot of inflammation in the human body. And that's something we need to be very, very cognizant of. Okay, so what are these drugs, these GLP-1 agonists? Well, we have a couple of them that are FDA approved, for example, in children. One of them is liraglutide, and the other one is semaglutide. Semaglutide is a weekly injection. Liraglutide is a daily oral medicine. These are GLP-1 agonists, so they turn on the GLP-1 receptor, actually pushing through all these functions. Why did they do the initial studies? Well, the reason being was they looked at children with severe weight gain or severe obesity, polycystic ovary syndrome, or hypothalamic obesity as a ways to try and get an understanding. As of November and December of this year, the FDA has approved semaglutide, I think it goes by the name Wegovy, in children 12 years of age and older with a BMI of greater than 95% for the treatment of excess weight gain. When we look at the studies, the first thing we'll do is look at some translational research. And there was a study that was commented on that was translationally done in Nature News. And Dr. Lanaro writes, quote, in one experiment, a GLP-1 receptor agonist called liraglutide alleviated liver inflammation in mice with fatty liver. A similar effect was observed in a pilot study in people. In other experiments in mice, liraglutide demonstrated anti-inflammatory potential in the kidneys and the heart. And GLP-1 itself reduces inflammation in fat tissue in obese and diabetic mice. We know from animal studies and human studies that GLP-1 seems to reduce inflammation almost everywhere, says Dr. Drucker on the study. The reductions in body weight and blood sugar that the drugs trigger probably help to control inflammation. But some of the drug's anti-inflammatory effects start even before meaningful weight loss is achieved. This is why scientists think there's a separate mechanism at play. End quote. So for me, this again, translational research, animal models saying this is what we're seeing, that even before the weight loss begins, there is a big change occurring when it comes to the understanding of why is GLP-1 as an agonist, the drug, having an effect on the system that we've talked about with that myriad response, liver, heart, brain, everywhere. We're seeing a difference. It's not just the weight loss. That's a wonderful byproduct, and weight loss is great. But what we're really talking about here is we care about the physiologic effect, the system's biology effect of what these drugs do, or frankly, what this incretin does endogenously, normally. We're, again, talking about the drugs here, but what do we really want to do normally in humans, right? So I think that's a big piece. The side effects of the drug, that's going to be something we have to really pay attention to, the cost of the drug. But right now, just understanding the science behind how it works and why it does what it does, I think it is super, super critical. So let's look at the first and most important study in kids, really the one that most of this is being based on. It's called the STEP-Teens trial, STEP-TEENS trial, which assessed the use of 2.4 milligrams of semaglutide versus placebo injected once weekly over a 68-week period. So a long study, over a year. Both groups were given lifestyle intervention education, which is important, and they were 201 children aged 12 to 18 in this original study. What they found was that the intervention reduced BMI greater than 95%, again, those are the only kids who could be enrolled, by 16%. There was no mention, and this is a key point we're going to have to come back to, there's no mention of the difference between is it lean body mass lost or fat mass lost, because that is critical missing data in these studies, because if it's all fat mass, that's fabulous. If it's a lot of lean body mass, that is not great. Protein, or from my perspective, muscle mass is super important to health over time. Also, they noted that 73% of the patients treated achieved at least a 5% reduction in body weight during that 68 weeks. That's a positive. Average weight of the patients enrolled was 236 pounds, and the average weight lost was around 33 pounds. So you achieved a weight loss of about down to 200. So that's meaningful. Is it where we need to get to? No. But again, is it a step in the direction? Is it part of the inflammatory process? Is it helping somebody have a ability to change their mind in the process? These are all questions that need to be asked and answered over time. The study also found some secondary findings that were not part of the initial study, but they found a reduction in waist circumference, a reduction in hemoglobin A1C, a reduction of ApoB proteins, or your LDL, VLDL proteins that are associated with cardiovascular risk, a reduction in triglycerides, and also a reduction in ALT, transaminases in the liver. Something else to think about in this process is that it is now known that insulin will reduce GLP-1 secretion. So hyperinsulinism will reduce GLP-1 secretion and block all of the beneficial effects that we just saw. What causes hyperinsulinism? Well, we know that. That is the consumption of ultra-processed foods, primarily in the form of sugared beverages, flour-based foods that spike insulin rapidly, right? Even though your insulin release will eventually bring that sugar down and keep her A1C normal in the beginning, over time, this is completely detrimental. And if this is having a negative effect on GLP-1 secretion, that's a double whammy. And that's what seems to happen, right? And this has been shown in vitro and in vivo that the inhibition of GLP-1 secretion occurs at the L cells in the intestine. So this is a problem. So insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, all the things that drive those processes are problematical, including the work of Rick Johnson, looking at uric acid. That's a byproduct of fructose metabolism, but also through the polyol pathway, the reverse engineering of fructose via glucose polymers or starches. So our highly ingested flour-based foods can drive this pathway. All these things are part and parcel to the dysfunction that we see in the inflammatory cascade that leads to the diseases of metabolic syndrome. These are critical events that need to be understood. But hyperinsulinism is a direct risk factor for not making enough natural endogenous GLP-1. And that, I think, is a story that needs to be discussed over and over again. Because again, if we're talking about the drugs, yes, they may be functional in this process, but what about the understanding of how we do this without medicine? That's, to me, one of the bigger pieces of this conversation. Another piece is leptin, in and of itself, the hormone that says that we're full. Leptin actually can stimulate GLP-1 secretion. If you have leptin resistance, you have the actual problem that leptin is not actually helping you get more GLP-1. So anything that causes leptin resistance, again, inflammation, Americanized standard ultra-processed foods, will cause increase in resistance to leptin activity. This will decrease your GLP-1, and that in and of itself is also problematic. Looking at the meta-analyses that are available, there's a meta-analysis in 2020 by Dr. Kelly et al. With 368 children with their elevated BMI, noting beneficial effect on glucose metabolism and homeostasis. Side effects, mostly GI, minimal, nothing major. 2020 meta-analysis by Chada et al. Looked at 286 children with the elevated BMI, but this group had type 2 diabetes mellitus and obesity, or obesity without type 2 diabetes, and found that the children that had diabetes lost less weight, but in general, glucose homeostasis was improved in both groups. And then finally, in 2023, a meta-analysis by Ryan looked at 574 children with BMI north of 95% and showed improved glycemic control overall. So we know that the drugs in the children, the GLP-1 agonists, do what they're supposed to do when it comes to lowering glucose and lowering inflammation. But are there problems? Is there anything we haven't thought of that, is potentially at play here that's problematical? Let's start thinking about that from the risk perspective. I think we've sort of, at this point, identified that what does GLP-1 do? How does it function? How beneficial is it as an endogenous incretin? We know it's fantastic. What blocks it? Hyperinsulinism, leptin resistance, I would think insulin resistance, all of that stuff is a big problem. And then finally, do we think that if we look at this from this perspective, that the risks outweigh the benefits? So let's now talk about the risks. Right? What do we think about that? So risks of off-label use, the first thing I think of in kids. What are the unknowns, right? So the data is pretty clear in adults that once you start this drug, you need to stay on it forever, or you'll gain the weight right back within a year. Now, everybody doesn't get exactly back to the same weight they were before they started, but they get back within 2/3 to 3/4 of their weight back within a year. Probability-wise, they'll get all the way back or more if they stay off it for multiple years. We don't have those studies yet. So we know you need to be on this for a long time. Is there a long-term consequence on growth? In children, again, in adults, different story, but in children, are we affecting growth? Are we affecting lean muscle mass? Haven't been answered, right? What's the balance of energy intake and energy expenditure that can modulate critical growth hormones during that period of adolescence? That's super important. What is growth hormone doing? What is IGF-1 doing? This is an appetite suppressant. It is antihedonic, and fatigue effects of these GLP-1 RA agonists, may alter the balance during these critical periods of growth in teenagers. A lot of questions here that I'd like answered before I'm going to dive into using these drugs pretty consistently. Abuse among patients, with eating disorders, right? So if you're a young person, teenager, and you want to be super skinny because you think that's what is right in your brain, regardless of the right or wrong, no judgment, just if you now think that this is a good drug, you may go out and buy it off the street. Like some other kid may have it and say, hey, I'll sell it to you and make some money. I know this sounds sort of sad and real, but it's real, right? Could that push somebody into even more problems when it comes to eating disorders? I care about that, right? So that's something we need to think about, and then competitive sports, wrestlers, right? I think about folks who are trying to cut weight to get ready for an event, right? Would they be now in the category of trying to get a hold of these drugs? Other athletes that are saying, I want to be skinnier, I want to do this, but I don't want to do the work on changing my diet and changing other things that are super important. So I think that is of concern to me. Then we have to talk about the side effects, right? What are they? Well, we know that this slows down your GI tract, right? And the biggest side effect that's been shown, that's a severe one, is pancreatitis. And pancreatitis, although rare, is a big deal. If you get it and it wipes out your pancreas, that to me would not be worth taking this drug. We need to find out who those people are at risk for it. That might be something down the road with the GWAS study or some other genomic analysis to be able to predict who those people are, but we don't know that yet. Then there's thyroid C-cell tumors that have been shown, and then sudden onset of gallbladder disease. These are all serious but rare side effects. The more moderate and more frequent side effects are hypoglycemia, right? So low blood sugar. And then the question I want to know is lean mass weight loss, right? Dr. Peter Attia did a strong analysis in one of his AMAs on his podcast and looked at this, and they showed that in the adult studies that, somewhere to 40 to 60% of the weight loss was actually muscle mass. That's not good. We don't know this in kids because, to my knowledge, I haven't seen it in any of the studies. I couldn't find it. So that's a big deal. If it's muscle mass loss, that's half of the weight. That's not great, right? So that would be something I'd want to know about. Mild GI distress and diarrhea, that's pretty common. It tends to fade over time from what I'm understanding. So that may or may not push someone not to want to take it anymore, but that's something to think about, right? And so we want to really think about this stuff, but we don't have great long-term data, more than a year in general at this point. And we will need to know that in order to truly say, hey, this is a drug I want to prescribe to teenagers for a long period of time. I think that's a really critical analysis point that we don't have yet. All the studies were done in general by the pharmaceutical companies. So there is that bias that we have to pay attention to always. Again, not saying it throws the studies out by any stretch. It doesn't. But it's just we have to have that critical eye to they have a vested interest in this drug selling because it makes them a lot of money. We need to understand how much of this data is verifiable. We need more data, right? So that's a big one. So then the big question I ask is, why are we using them at all? The reason is because we failed as a medical community at stemming the tide of excess weight gain and then the problematical metabolic diseases that follow. And this comes for a myriad of reasons, right? Exposure to toxins in the environment that promote metabolic changes, right? These are obesogens. These are big problems in our environment that we are not effectively controlling. We have a federal government that subsidizes corn, soy, and wheat, and primarily corn, that then is flooding our environments with cheap, ultra-processed foods, especially sugared beverages, which hit the liver super fast and kick out a whole cascade of survival genes that say store fat, make us more hungry, increase blood pressure, and, make more liver fat. This is a huge problem, and we're force-feeding it on the front end by making the foods that aren't good for us exceedingly cheap. But then if you want something that's very good for you, like good quality meats, good quality fruits and vegetables, they're more expensive. So we have a very big disconnect as to how we, as a society of medicine providers, coupled to a government, are not working together to end up helping the kids on the front end in the first place. I think the major change that needs to occur is you just stop subsidizing the bad foods and start subsidizing the good foods and see what happens then. Right? We need adequate environments for these kids to be able to play safely and burn energy. If you take somebody who has type 1 diabetes, put them on a bicycle and ride them up a hill, once they start exercising, the glucose transporter 4 in the muscle cells independently rises to the surface of the cell to let sugar in for the activity. This is insulin independent. So therefore, we know that exercise is a massive upstream benefit to reducing blood sugar issues, right? We know this. When I was in residency at University of Virginia, we used to take children to a camp, and a lot of the children had type 1 diabetes. And on the days where we couldn't exercise because it was raining, the blood sugars were much harder to control. And that was because of this effect of the muscle, insulin-independent activity. So having safe environments for kids to play outside, having more exercise in primary school, right? We sort of not spending enough time encouraging kids to exercise, especially as kids get heavier, they don't want to exercise. We have to get into this paradigm of understanding that it is our job as parents, as guiders of their health, to get them moving. That's a big thing. Kids need to move. Since the dawn of time, children have moved a ton. It's only the recent years that we're not doing this enough. We need to really look at what's messing up the microbiome. Excessive use of antibiotics, excessive use of antacids and other drugs that are known to disrupt microbiome activity. Antibiotics are becoming a huge problem. We'll get into that in another talk, but we need to focus on what makes children more prone to bacterial infections. I think always here of milk protein intolerance. I think of kids who have food intolerances, food allergies, promoting mucus generation in the hollow spaces. What are your hollow spaces? It's your gut, it's your lungs, your sinuses, your ears, right? That's where we have these hollow spaces, your mouth. And in those spaces, mucus will develop in response to intolerances, right? Also, traditional allergies from outdoor pollens and grains and all of those associated exposures inhalationally or orally, right? That's going to promote mucus development. Well, when you have a lot of mucus floating around the system, it's a petri dish or a hot tub for bacteria to grow, increases antibiotic use. Antibiotic use disrupts the microbiome. That leads to this full circle event of dysbiosis that we then end up having increased inflammation, and we're off to the races. It's a big problem. Recently, more and more data showing up about circadian biology. We know that if you follow the sun and the moon more, i.e. get up when the sun comes up, go to bed, or at least get the lights out of your life when the sun goes down, hormones, proteins, immunological function, everything is optimized according to the circadian biology. If you don't follow that pattern, you have worse metabolics. You have worse function. We know that at the early time of day, your response to vaccines will be better than if you have your vaccine at night. Why? Because the immune system upregulates most in the morning. Why would that anthropologically make sense? Well, when would you be exposed to pathogens in millions or thousands of years ago, right? Well, you do it when you're touching other people or you're exposed to food. When does that happen? When the sun comes up. You wake up, you start talking to other folks, you go work with other folks, you start eating with other folks. So it makes sense that the immune system would be set up to increase its function during those times. So we want to work with the biology of our anthropology in order to allow us to function the best in modern society. We're flip-flopping that. It's very dysfunctional. One of the things getting in the way of kids is screens at night. So start thinking about all of these things. And again, microbiome dysregulation is a big, big, big piece of this conversation. So if we could attack all of these things head on at the governmental, federal, at the governmental, state, and at the governmental, local level, i.e., primarily in schools, where we have 66% of the food going into these kids, a lot of time with them on a 5-day-a-week cycle, we might be able to disrupt this pattern that has become so dysfunctional and not need GLP-1 agonists at all, right? Because when you come back to the entire discussion in the first place, obesity is a modern issue at the volume it is now. Metabolic syndrome is a modern issue at the volume it is now. This is not a dysfunction of our genes. This is not a dysfunction of anthropology or history. This is a dysfunction of our modern society not pairing up well. We are polar bears in the desert. That is the critical take-home piece. Now, again, not saying that these drugs may not be used, not saying these drugs may not be fully functional over time. But right now, we're putting our eggs in the wrong basket as far as I'm concerned. We're spending too much time thinking about how to stop it on the back end instead of working super hard on stopping this stuff on the front end, right? And then the big question comes back. Are you really going to take this drug forever? Because if you don't change your lifestyle or your child doesn't change their lifestyle inputs, they're going to be on this drug forever. At what cost, right? That's a big question. Some people are saying this is going to be about $15,000 per kid per year. That's unsustainable in a modern environment where I can't even get the money for some of our children on Medicaid rolls to get adequate services as it is, let alone add in another $15,000 a year per kid. Forget it. That has to be a big part of this calculation. So ultimately, we want to ask the question, should we be putting our eggs in the basket of a drug that you need to take forever that's super expensive? That, albeit looks like it's going to work well, with some rare but serious side effects. A big question mark about, is there a lean mass component to this in kids? And if that's the case, I'm not super thrilled about that. There's a lot of questions here. I'm not sold yet that GLP-1 agonists are the way to go for stopping the problem of obesity. Then we can flip into the discussions of what other things can we do other than what I just discussed: changing food for kids, increasing exercise for kids, avoiding toxins for kids, doing all these lifestyle inputs that would reduce the stress on the body that's causing inflammation, that's causing metabolic syndrome and all these other problems. Well, is there a way to increase GLP naturally, right? Well, we talked about some of that, right? We want to keep insulin down, but want to let leptin increase. Those two functions will help to increase the release of GLP-1 endogenously. So how do we do that? Again, it's all those same inputs: changing the food intake, increasing exercise, avoiding toxins, right? This is all part of this. But oh, by the way, what about bacteria? Turns out there's a probiotic out now with Akkermansia muciniphila. That Akkermansia muciniphila in the probiotic by Pendulum actually increases GLP-1, right? And there's a study in Cell Metabolism by Patrice Kani and Claude Nauf, Knauf. Patrice Kani, one of the thought leaders in the world on low-level endotoxemia in the gut microbiome from dysbiosis, has written an article called "A Newly Identified Protein from Akkermansia muciniphila Stimulates GLP-1 Secretion." And he writes in the article, I'm going to read it: Akkermansia muciniphila is a gut commensal known to improve host metabolism. The outer membrane protein AMUC-1100 has been shown to partially replicate these beneficial effects. Here, Yoon et al. In 2021 have identified a novel protein, P9, secreted by Akkermansia muciniphila that stimulates GLP-1 secretion, thereby adding new insight to the biomolecule era to treat metabolic disease. That, to me, is where I could see some benefit. Why don't we look at that microbe and maybe give ourselves back that microbe if we're missing it in the first place? And that may be driving part of this. In a second article published in Nature Microbiology in 2021, entitled Akkermansia muciniphila secretes a glucagon-like peptide 1 induced protein that improves glucose homeostasis and ameliorates metabolic disease in mice. And in the diagram, you can see it shows a picture of the Akkermansia bug touching the mucus surface and triggering a response inside the gut lining that changes IL-6, GLP-1 activation comes in. So thermogenesis goes up, body weight goes down, glucose homeostasis goes up, right? So, interesting. So an animal model, translationally, is a window into looking at how Akkermansia, this very important commensal flora that we're known to have, that's a keystone species, could be involved in the GLP-1 story. More to be said here, but there is a probiotic out there produced by the company Pendulum. I think it's called Glucose Control, that's involved in this. So maybe something to think about in this process. Ultimately, I think going through this discussion as we have to ask the questions. One, are we willing to put our children on these drugs for life at the cost of $15,000 a year at this point, roughly, without doing the real due diligence as a government, as a medical body of pediatricians, as parents, as the agriculture community, as the toxicological community of producing these chemicals? Are we not going to do the work to look there first, to stop the inputs that are driving the disease in the first place, as opposed to just saying we have a magic bullet with GLP-1 agonists? I tend to think we should be doing a lot more work on the front end than on the back end. If GLP-1 agonists come down in price tremendously, have almost no side effects, and tend to do their job while people working on their lifestyle, so be it. But for me, I don't see how spending that much money without doing the due diligence work on the front end is going to be in our best long-term benefit. And when I mean our society as Americans. So that's the big question. Here's the data. You guys get to choose. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I appreciate you. I'm Dr. Magryta, and you're welcome to follow me on Dr. M's Women and Children First podcast, but I'm here just to do my best to shed light on the information that's out there for kids. Have a great day.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.